Okay, so hopefully you are all set, ready to go. We're going to be doing knife skills specifically to preparing soup. Pasta fajoule is what I'm going to be making now. So I've already washed my hands. I have an apron on. I've pulled my hair back. If you want to get in the habit, you can cover your hair, but at least make sure that it's not hanging forward or anywhere near cooking surfaces. We remember that's the number one physical contaminant found in food. So knife skills, I think one of my favorite things that I ever learned about knife skills was chopping an onion. So that's where we'll start. It's at the top of your ingredient list. So what we're doing now, do you remember what that's called? Has the French name, mise en place, everything in its place. So if you start at the top of that recipe list, you will see that it says all your equipment. You should have that all out. And then have all your vegetables ready for cutting. So the first one is 1 medium to large onion, or you can use frozen onions. So that can be a time saver. It might be a little bit more expensive. So the first thing, of course, I've already peeled this onion, and sometimes you have to take off the first layer with that. I might pull up a little bit of this. The next thing that you're gonna do is cut the onion pole to pole. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut the onion pole to pole, and then I have the 2 halves of the onion. So I'm gonna start with 1 half. I'm gonna cut off this tip end. I'm gonna leave the rooty end there. All right. So one reason that we cut things pole to pole is one of the most important things with knife skills is to get yourself a flat surface so that nothing wobbles around or moves when you're cutting. And if your cutting board moves, you can put a damp towel underneath to hold it in place, but try to make sure that it's on a solid surface. When you're cutting, you're going to use the claw technique. So that means that you're always pulling your fingertips underneath and using your knuckles as a guide. When you do that, you want to make sure your thumb isn't sticking out, because that's a tip, again, that if you cut with a knife and your thumb is in the way, you can cut your thumb. The other way that you're going to cut, sometimes you're going to cut in between your hands, and you might put your fingers on the outside, but your goal is to have the knife blade as far away from your fingers as possible. So I'm gonna stabilize this onion first, and I'm gonna make horizontal cuts from that edge back toward the root, but I'm not gonna cut through the root. So I've made a cut that's about a 1/4 inch. So if you look at your thumbnail, that's about 1 inch, good way to measure in the kitchen. So cutting back about a 1/4 inch, and I'm gonna do that all the way up and keep putting pressure. As I get closer, I'm gonna wanna make sure that I stay away from my fingertips. Could also use a fork to hold the onion in place if you're not feeling comfortable with your knife skills just yet. So once I have those kind of fairly even layers that way, the next way that I'm gonna cut this onion, and it still holds together, is from that root, from just about a 1/4 inch from the edge of the root out to the cut end. And I'm gonna make about 1/4 inch, because I'm just chopping this onion. And so I'm holding the onion together on the outsides, but as I get close to the outside edge, I'm gonna move my hand out of the way as much as possible, or just make sure it's nice and secure. I like to start from the middle of the onion and then work out to the edges. It helps hold everything together a little better and for as long as possible. So now I have the horizontal cuts, I have the vertical cuts, onion is still held together. So the last way that I'm gonna cut this onion is across the top in about 1/4 inch strips that way. And I'm going to start from the outside, so away from the root. I'm going to use the claw and I'm going to hold it in place. Tuck my fingers back. And now the onion is going to give me a nice small chop. And some of Knife Skills and how you cut things, especially when it's for your own personal taste, is going to depend on what you like. I tend to like things a little chunkier. This is a recipe that you can also puree. Generally, when you're talking about a soup, you want to be able to get a bite of everything, and any little last pieces, you might just chop off the sides. You want to get a bite of everything in each mouthful. So if there are parts that haven't cut, there's a piece of the root in there, so I'm not going to use that. Oh, also good to have a scrap bowl handy, right? So I have my nice pile of onion. If I see any pieces that got missed close to the root, I'm just gonna run my knife through those. When I'm running my knife through those, I'm keeping the tip on the cutting board and using a rocking motion back and forth, nice and smooth, using about the middle of the blade to cut for these items. When you clean things off your knife, you want to not have your fingertips near the blade. When you move things around on your cutting board, you're going to use the spine of the knife to move things off to the side, move that nice pile of onion off to the side. You might have something to wipe your knife down with, right? Handy. Good idea to wash your knife in between items as well. So the next thing that I'm going to cut is what we have next on the list are the 2 carrots finely chopped. So I've already peeled the carrots. I'm gonna take off the tip of each carrot. Of course, I've washed them. So all cutting techniques like the chop, unless you're doing an onion where you kind of want it to hold together, all cutting techniques are pretty much a variation of a slice. So the first thing that you want to do, again, carrots can roll around. So we want to get these a little bit more stable. So I like to cut the carrots into smaller pieces to make it easier to get into slices. So I'm going to cut them into 3 equal parts. Hold them while I do that. And the next thing that I want to do is get a flat surface. So similar to the onion, you can cut it in half. Again, my hands are holding sturdily on the outside to hold it into place. So I've got these carrots cut into halves now. I can take a little tiny piece of the rounded edge off so that it's flat on both sides. And I'm just gonna do 1 piece to show you here. So carrots are a great thing to practice cutting. You can make all the different kinds of cuts while you practice. So I wanna get these into strips. And again, I'm gonna hold on the outside to make these long slices. And I'm gonna take a look. I want these finely diced, so these are a little bit bigger. And I cut each one of those down in half. And I have these nice little sticks now. So from these nice little sticks, I can get into a fine dice. Again, tip of the blade staying on the cutting board, running kind of the mid to the back part of the blade through. I have a nice little pile of carrots. I'm going to continue with all the carrots to do that. Good practice. And the next ingredient that we have on the list is the 2 ribs of celery. So these are celery hearts because that's what they had at the store. If I'm making soup, a lot of times I will get some of the celery leaves if they're still attached and put those in as well. So just taking a little cut off the ends. Celery, good again to hold the outer edges. Just run the tip of your knife blade through to cut down, and once you get that cut started, your hands aren't even near where the knife is. So running that through a few times, depending on the size of your celery, or if it gets larger toward the end, you may need to run through your knife another time so that you get kind of that 1/8 inch piece of celery in the end, same size as our carrots. And then you can line a few of those sticks together just like we did with the carrots. Same movement, same use of the claw. You can either move your hand back, and then when you get toward the end, you can use your hand as well to push the items toward the knife. And as you get toward the very end, move your hand. If you have a good cutting board, good knife, it'll still continue to slide through. So garlic. You can use garlic in a jar that's already minced. That's one option. I tend to be a big fan of fresh garlic. Sometimes your peel comes off nice and easy. You can just pull it right off. Other times can be a little more challenging. And another great way to do it is to put your knife with the blade angled down. You can just give a little bit of a smash to the garlic, helps you take the skin off easier, the outside peel there. It also starts to release. You can smell the garlic when you do that. It starts to release the aromatics and kind of awaken the garlic. So garlic is another one, right? It's small and you want to keep your fingers out of the way. So this is one where, you know, you can use your hand just kind of as a guide at the back. I make cuts through the garlic in one direction and maybe some smaller slices through. So once I end up with slices, little slices of garlic, then turning it or turning your knife, going the opposite direction. And if you need to nudge anything toward the knife, just pulling your fingertips out of the way until get that garlic nice and small for a mince. So minced, you're gonna be kind of teeny tiny there. And you can just run your knife through it in both directions. Make sure it tends to like to stick to the knife blade, keeping that out of the way. Use the back to make a little pile and put it all together again and run the knife through again. So all good there. All right, so you have all those things to practice with. You can pause in between each one and practice or replay. So the other thing that I want to show you is your greens and your herbs. So for your greens, we have a Swiss chard here. So it says that you can use 2 cups. I'm going to use a bunch. I never measure my greens, but 2 cups Tuscan kale, chard, or collard greens, and chopped with the ribs removed. So for Swiss chard, often you may still use the ribs in a recipe. Kale, you definitely don't use it. But for Swiss chard, the ribs are a little more tender. I'll probably chop these up and put them in with my onions just so that I get to eat them. For greens like this, I like to just hold them up. If your knife is sharp and your greens are fresh, you can just run down along next to the rib and slide your greens off. I'll save that for later. Some of my greens were a little broken or wilted. If they're just wilted, you can put your greens in a glass of water while you're prepping everything else, and it'll bring them back to life a little bit. You can also, of course, lay it down on the cutting board. Just run your knife along the side, and as you go, you might stack your leaves. You can also fold the leaves across and cut down along next to the rib. If you are using kale and it's kind of hardy and tough, you may decide to buy your kale pre-chopped too. Of course, you can do that. You could also buy frozen kale. But what you might decide to do is with kale, sometimes if it's like super fresh and crisp, I'll just rip it off of the stems, just kind of, and at the same time tear it into the bite-sized pieces so that there's less to chop. Swiss chard, the leaves are a little bit more tender than kale. So, and I would normally use kale in this. I'm just using Swiss chard because we're eating something else this week with kale in it, and I wanted to vary our greens up a little bit so that we don't feel like we're eating kale all the time. Okay, so almost have all my Swiss chard, and we're not doing collard greens because they must not have looked as good as the kale, because I just told my grocery shopping husband to just get whichever one looked good. I like to roll my Swiss chard up because the leaves are flat, so it can roll up in a nice packet. And I will do the same thing with collard greens. If your kale is curly, this won't work, and you'll just put it down and chop it if you haven't torn it up. But this is cutting off these like small rolls, almost like doing a chiffonade, but rolling them up nice and tight, cutting them into small slices, and then I go through the other way a few times. Greens shrink up so much. Swiss chard shrinks a little bit less than kale, and I know that my people like it kind of in small pieces. So I'm ending up with Swiss chard pieces a little bigger, about 2.5 inches, 2 inches, square, rectangular, somewhere around there, and it'll wilt down. Your herbs. So herbs can be good too. You want to make sure they're washed first. And then things like parsley has long stems, so cutting it as close as you can to those long stems. We want to use, for our parsley, about 1/4 cup of parsley, which of course you can measure that. Got about 1/4 cup there. I'm going to get rid of any big stems. Just pick up by the stems and cut the parsley off. Another great tool that you can use if you have it in the kitchen, if you have kitchen shears that are nice and clean, that you only use for kitchen stuff, those are great to cut up herbs. All right, say that's pretty good. I'm just gonna make a pile of the parsley, and I'm just gonna run my knife through it. Again, tip down, and you can kind of go, keeping the tip down, just move it in an arc. The big thing when you're doing any kind of cutting to save your hands and your wrist and not get tired from cutting, if you've ever gotten tired, is to make sure that you're not doing a lot of the like noisy cuts. Sometimes we kind of see the fast knife work and noisy cuts on cooking shows, but really it's just about being easy, moving through, flowing with rhythm, letting your wrist move, letting your arm move, and let the knife do the work. Okay,